Ontario's 21st Premier spent almost 4 decades in politics. He did his share of dishing it out and taking it. Like all politicians, he won some and lost some. With all of that perspective, Bob Rae has now written a book whose title asks a very good question. What's happened to politics? Let's find out. Here's Bob Rae, and we're always happy to welcome you back to TVO.
Great to be back. Thank you.
I'm going to start by quoting yourself back to you. Here's an excerpt from the book. This book is not a memoir or an exercise in nostalgia. It is not a tell-all or a morality play in which the hero inevitably wins out in the end. It is a reflection on some lessons learned, many after defeats rather than victories. It is a plea for political literacy and understanding, for citizens to look behind and beyond the partisan rhetoric and the spin. More than anything, it is meant to open a conversation, one that, as a country, we desperately need to have. So let's continue that conversation. What is the focus of the conversation we desperately need to have?
I think it's on how do you make, really quite simply, how do you make politics more substantive? How do you give more substance to the choices, and how do you convince the politicians and those who are organizing political campaigns to try to make them be about something and not about nothing?
I don't have to tell you, there are plenty of people in the country who think we are too far gone for that. Is that true?
Well, the problem is we're not alone. I mean, this is not what's happened is not a uniquely Canadian phenomenon. It's happened in other countries, more or less. A lot of it depends on how politicians work themselves, how political leadership unfolds, emerges, takes on positions. I think in Europe today, for example, you look at what Chancellor Merkel is doing on the refugee question, and you have to say, well, there's substance and there's leadership, and there's somebody saying, we're not going to redefine our country. We understand what's at stake here for the reputation of Europe and for the health of the whole European continent, and here's what needs to be done. And so politicians who kind of try to get around that or appeal to kind of purely populist thinking and temporarily there in the population that might be very anti-immigrant or
I'm inferring you're not a big fan of Donald Trump then.
Not at all. Having said that, what I think people like about Donald Trump is what they liked about Rob Ford. And they like the fact that he wasn't that scripted, and he isn't that scripted. And he says what's on his mind. So that's good. The trouble is, what's on his mind? That's not so good.
That's not so good. Okay. You make a plea in your book for political literacy, and I wonder what's in the quiver of a citizen of Canada who has more political literacy?
I think it's, first of all, understanding, if I may say so, your business, because all of politics is filtered through the media. There's nothing that happens that doesn't happen through the media, through radio, television, social media, ads, books, whatever it may be. That's the way things are. Now, we teach literacy. We teach people how to read. Kids learn how to read when they're very young, and people learn how to engage that way. We don't spend enough time really trying to help people understand what are politicians doing when they do what they do. What is the message they're trying to convey? What is the message in advertising? What techniques are people using to try to persuade you to think one way or another? It's not that complicated, but sometimes I'm amazed at how people will look at something on television and say, well, that's true. And you sort of say, well, actually, no, it isn't. It actually isn't. Well, how can they say things that just aren't true? I said, I don't know how they can, but they do. And that's what happens.
Can I get you to gauge that? I mean, you're an active social media user. I see you on Twitter all the time. You obviously watch the newscasts and current affairs programs. What percentage of what you see on television is sort of irrelevant, designed to spur on the food fight, BS, and what percentage is actually useful for a citizen?
Well, the trouble with what's happened to television is that everything has become condensed, so that there are no long conversations on television.
We're about to have one, Mr. Rae.
We're having one, but this is an exception. So when I say take the TV news, I mean, when I started out in scrums, they would go for a long period of time. And when I went on television, there were some 4, 5, 6 minutes. and you would have 30-second, 40-second clips
In a news piece.
in a news piece. That's the way it was in those days. So if you could temper yourself to remember that, you'd be fine. But now, radio clip is 10 seconds, 20
Less,
seconds.
5.
It can be nothing. So you're constantly being, as a consumer of this stuff, you're being bombarded with this every few seconds. You're being bombarded with messages. So the way the politicians, I think now more and more respond is that everything is shorter, everything is more repetitive, and everything is said over and over again. And it's all increasingly packaged. It's not to say that, I mean, sociologists or whoever would tell you, we're all packaged. We all dress in a certain way. We look like we look. We present ourselves to the world in a certain way. So everybody's a package in that sense. But what I'm saying in the book is it's more packaged. It's even more packaged than it was before. It's even more repetitive than it was before. And it's lacking in almost all spontaneity. And when that happens, people forget how to respond to crises. People forget how to respond to events. People forget the need to pivot. And I understand from watching you on Twitter that you're a bit of a sports buff. And you know that greatness in sport is not simply the repetition of a rote activity. Greatness in sport is defined by imagination, creativity, innovation. Those are all the things. How much imagination, creativity, and innovation do we see in an election campaign or in politics? Very little.
Have you seen any in this campaign?
Well, I think events have forced it. I think, for example, the changing recognition of the economic challenges that we're facing as a country has led Mr. Trudeau to make a decision, which was to say, his platform now says, we're committed to investing more than we might have done a year ago on a consistent basis in transit and in infrastructure and other things of a permanent nature. And that will, in all probability, mean that Canada will run a deficit for a couple of years, all other things being equal. And that's been attacked by the other parties because it means that Canada's quote going back into deficit. But the one thing Mr. Trudeau has done is he started a conversation with Canadians and said, here's something we need to talk about. Here's something that needs to be discussed. The other two guys aren't talking about it. I'm talking about it. And so that's been a bit of a game changer. Obviously, the refugee crisis has changed things in ways that I'm sure neither Mr. Harper nor the other leaders, frankly, expected that they would then have to say, well, what are you going to do about it? And not just have, well, I'll get back to you in 3 days. You got to say, what are you going to do? And I think most people, a lot of people have found, I'm not getting into a partisan thing here, I would say a lot of Canadians have found that Mr. Harper's response has been too simply repetition of the previous line and position that he took. And the trouble with that is, if circumstances change and you're stuck simply repeating the same old lines, you lose people, because people say, well, wait a minute, we've moved on from there, and now we're facing this, so what are you going to do about that?
But as you've defined it, we appear to be in thick soup right now, because the public's estimation of politicians is not very high, and the public's estimation of the media, from whom they get their information so they can judge the politicians, is not very high. So what do we do about this conundrum?
Well, it's going to depend on the media and politicians changing, and that's in a sense what the book calls for. It calls for citizens to get more engaged, for citizens to demand more, and for more people to come forward and say, there's got to be a better way to do this. I mean, for example, I think the way that the parties collectively have handled the whole debate question has been a disgrace. I just think it's ridiculous to have a 12 or 10 or 12 week campaign, however long it is, it seems to be almost interminable, without having a regular contact and exchange between the leaders to talk about issues of substance, to talk about the refugee crisis, just to say, okay, next week, this is what we're going to talk about. We'll have 2 hours, we'll have them there, we'll get it done. I don't know why that, I know why one or two leaders might say, well, I don't really want to do that. Mm-hmm. But I think there has to be a much greater insistence on the part of everybody. Well, no, you do have to do that. That's what's expected. That's That's the game that we play. That's how the game is. Here are the rules of the game. We're playing, to go back to sports, this is how you play baseball. You can't say, I only want to play 5 innings. You say, well, no, I'm sorry, it's a 9-inning game, sir. That's what the game is. And too many times I think we're letting the politicians get away with saying, this isn't how I'm going to play this anymore. I'm going to play it this way. And I think we've seen it the way people handle Parliament, the way the parliamentary press gallery gets treated. And that's a lot of the ways in which, during a non-campaign, in which people get their information.
So at the moment, the traditional consortium-led leaders debate has 2 participants, Justin Trudeau, Elizabeth May. Should the broadcasters simply say, we're going ahead with this thing, and we'll put 2 empty podiums up there if you 2 other guys don't want to show up?
Absolutely.
They should do that.
Absolutely.
And will they get hammered for looking like they're taking sides if they do that?
I don't care. Who cares? I think they have to. I think you have to. I think there should be a lot of that kind of thing going on. I think people should just say, well, we're having a debate, and if you don't want to come, that's your problem. But we're going to have a debate anyway, and let Justin Trudeau and Elizabeth May say or do whatever they want to say or do. I think that's the way it should be.
One of the chapters in your book is focused on a call for leadership. As you look at the country today, and I don't just mean in politics, I mean in anything, in business, in special interest groups, in civil society, in sports, in whatever, where are the best leaders in the country today? What are they doing?
Well, first of all, there are, in every field, there are a lot of very fine people, a lot of very fine leaders. They're not necessarily people that everybody knows about, but there are certainly a lot of examples that I can think of in every field where you see people who are really quite exceptional in the kind of things that I talk about in the book. What are we looking for in a leader? Somebody who's got a vision and who's not afraid to say, well, this is where I think we need to go, but who also understands that there's no point in saying that unless you've got some people behind you. If you don't have anybody behind you, you're not a leader. You might be a prophet, but if people are not behind you, then, but you can't just be, saying I want to catch up to the parade, because you don't know which direction the parade is going to go in.
You know John Boehner's line on that? Love this line. He says, if you're a leader and nobody's following, you're just a guy out for a walk.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
But there have historically been a lot of people in that circumstance.
And using those criteria that you just did, though, saying people who've got extraordinary vision, know where they want to go, can bring people with them, are there people in politics today that you see who have those qualities? Well,
I think all of the people who are running for Parliament and parliamentary leadership, I think the 4-party leaders, including Elizabeth May, all have some of those qualities. I'm not saying all of them are perfect or all of them are amazing, but they certainly have some of them in terms of having a very clear sense of where they want to go. I think each of the leaders has that. I think the question is, do they have the capacity to persuade? Is the vision one that enough people can say, this is a really worthy idea and one that's going to take me as far as I want to go? But I know, as I said, it's vision, it's persuasion, and then it's execution. Can you actually do the things that you say you're going to do? And that's always an even tougher test.
You also say in the book that most Canadians don't want a viciously partisan left-right divide in the country. I wonder why you think that, because certainly the way politics is practiced in this country right now, it seems to be all about solidify the base and then see what you can pick up on the margins to win. It looks like it's all about the left-right divide.
Well, I don't know. Is that true? You got right now, according to whatever we're told in the poll of polls, it's about a third.
Right.
And at some point, maybe somebody will break out of that. Anybody who says, I know today what's going to happen on October the 19th, just doesn't understand the game, doesn't understand the nature of the game. The game is just, in a sense, just beginning again. Although I think a lot of people find that hard to take, the fact that it's going that direction. But no, I do think that if you even look at the way our political system has evolved in many respects, the parties have tried to go beyond their base. Successful parties have tried to go beyond their base, understanding that there's a broader section of the electorate that's not committed to anybody. Now, all of the studies, and I talk about them in the book, show very clearly that in most countries, including Canada for sure, fewer and fewer people identify themselves as political partisans. Fewer and fewer people, as a proportion of the general population, say, I'm a New Democrat, I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative. My father was a conservative, my mom, I've always been not so much anymore.
We're more persuadable.
Everybody, there are groups of people who are much less persuadable, but they're not in the majority. And that's what makes elections in Canada so interesting, is because people are actually making up their mind through the process. And more critically, for our purposes today, they're making up their minds later and later in the process, which is again what makes the art of predicting, well, what's going to happen? How is this going to turn out? Much less of an unknown. We don't know, because we don't know how people will respond to the critical messages and choices of the last week. And I think that's what it's going to be in Canada this time. I think the week after Thanksgiving, I think Canadians will be together, and over that Thanksgiving weekend in their homes and talking to their families and talking to their friends and neighbors. And I think that then that last weekend, people are going to make a choice. And it could lead to a very different result from the one that anybody today might predict is the logical answer.
So you've got 2 months of prelude and then a few days of really talking turkey.
Yes.
No Thanksgiving pun intended. I didn't mean it that way. You've spent a great deal of your life, and I think it's very much a full-time part of your life right now, trying to improve the plight of Aboriginal people in this country. And so I want to ask you about that, because you do touch on it in the book as well. It's not a slam dunk that everybody thinks that Indigenous Canadians should vote in this election. What do you think? Should they?
Well, I mean, with the caveat that it's up to anybody to decide whether they're going to vote, I do think, yes, I do. I do think that it's going to take a real engagement on the part of Aboriginal people across the country in talking and engaging with other Canadians to try to move beyond the stalemate that we're in. One of the things I talk about in the book is how it's partly a function of numbers. The polling data would tell you today that most Canadians, while they will from time to time be very moved by a particular picture, as they have been in the terrible, tragic photograph of that young baby on the beach, and there will be other pictures of that kind and other things that will move people for a period of time. But the issue for Aboriginal people is that they are maybe 5-10% of the population, max, if you took all the numbers together and said, here are all the people who self-identify, other people who have a relationship with the Aboriginal community. It's not a majority of Canadians. So there's 2 avenues that are open. One of them is the legal route, which is the one that's been taken a lot, and the court has made a huge difference. If you have rights, the rights will be taken up by the courts, and the courts will force unhappy majorities and unhappy majority governments to do things they don't really want to do, but they have to do them. Mm-hmm. And that's in good measure what's happened in Canada since the mid-1970s. The other thing you have to do is persuade the majority that it's time to do this, that there's a moral obligation that takes you in a direction, and there's also a real self-interest for the whole country to take us to a different space on this issue. And I think that's happening more now than ever before. I think you have more leadership in the Aboriginal community engaging politically, engaging economically with their communities and with people around them. And I think there's a greater willingness in the country to do more, but it takes leadership. And that's where we go back to this question of what are the party leaders going to do? What are they committed to doing? And what are they committed to talking about before an election? And what are they committed to talking about during an election? And what are they committed to doing when they're in government? And unfortunately, and it's true for this issue, it's true for a number of other issues, it often takes a crisis to kind of force people to say, well, now we're going to have to deal with this. And when things seem to be not facing a crisis, it's harder and harder to kind of garner the kind of attention that the issues need. But this is not an issue that's going to go away, so we're going to have to figure out more ways to keep it on the agenda.
I know in your almost 4 decades in public life you made a lot of friends, but this just in, you made a few enemies as well. Maybe enemies is putting it too strongly, but there were people who were critical of what you did. Don't take this the wrong way, but there will be some people who will say, sure, Bob Rae, now that you've had your chance in public life to throw a lot of slings and arrows the other way, now that you're out of it, you want a more civil tone in public life, despite the fact that you've I think you've admitted in the past that you've contributed your share to some of the ills that you're writing about in this book. How accepting are people going to be of this deathbed conversion of yours?
Well, first of all, I mean, number of points that I would make. First point is,
it's a bit of a loaded question.
it's not exactly my deathbed. I'm 67 and hale and hearty, and looking forward to engaging with Canadians for a number of decades to come, God willing. So I'm still around. Secondly, look, all of our lives are a mix of things. We don't always live up to the standards we set for ourselves. We sometimes slip and fall. Certainly I have. I think sometimes, the drive to be funny or the drive to make fun sometimes makes you say things that, you wish you'd had an ability to retract them and say, well, I didn't really mean to say that. But what I do think, though, in sort of apologia, as Cardinal Newman would say, I think a lot of my life has been about this. I have found, for example, that some of my strongest friendships are with people in other parties. That is not a recent phenomenon. That's been true for my whole time in politics. I think a lot of the time when I was in active politics, many of my colleagues would have liked me to have been far more partisan than I was. And rather were taken aback when I would say extremely nice things about my opponents, whether it was the lady in Scott or William Davis or lots of people in provincial politics that I knew very well and had a lot of affection for, as much as we had huge arguments over issues. Similarly, federally as well. But what I've seen happen, I mean, part of the sort of the inspiration for this book, if you like, it was not a positive one. It was coming back into the House of Commons in 2008 and saying something has really changed here. This is not the place I left in 1982. This is much more partisan. This is much more packaged. This is much more repetitive, with people asking questions by rote, people answering questions by rote.
Would you apportion the blame equally for that state of affairs? Pretty
much. I mean, one can do an analysis and say, well, how did it happen? But I think there's enough of blame to go around to all the parties and say everybody's contributed to this atmosphere, and it's going to take some considerable effort in the next Parliament federally to say, well, how can we change this?
It's interesting you didn't take the bait there, because of course I invited you in some ways to say, no, of course Harper's made it worse. It's Harper's fault. You didn't do that. A lot of Liberals and New Democrats would do that. Why didn't you go there?
Well, because I think Mr. Harper has not made it any better, and I think he's probably as good, if I can use that word, or professional, or tough-minded a practitioner of the art of packaging and slicing and dicing the population and going hard after a particular group of people. But if you said to me, did Mr. Harper invent this? The answer is no, he did not invent this. And it would be inaccurate to say that he did. What is accurate to say is that nobody has taken it to the heights that he has. And even with respect to the PMO, you have to say, look, the centralization of power in the Premier's office or the First Minister's office is not unique to Mr. Harper, but he's certainly taken it to a degree where you say, holy cow, when you go that far and you look at those stupid emails, Duffy emails, you sort of say, this is taking things much further than I think anybody might have wanted.
So you've tried to start a conversation, and I wonder, is it harder to have the conversation during an election campaign?
I don't think so. I actually think, the book has had a good response in terms of people, commenting on it and writing op-eds and people getting involved in discussing it. And I think people looking at the election and saying, yeah, there is a problem here, or watching how campaigns unfold and say, why aren't they talking about these issues in a substantive way? We haven't had, throughout the entire campaign practically, we haven't had a serious discussion on healthcare. It happens to be the big social policy priority of most Canadians. And it's kind of ironic that nobody's talking about it.
Mr. Rae, you've made many visits to the studio as a Member of Parliament, Leader of the Opposition, Premier, National Liberal Leader. but you're making one for the first time today as something else. A grandpa.
Grandpa.
Congratulations on that.
Thank you very much. I'm a happy grandpa.
I can tell. I can tell. Even though your grandchild was on Twitter the other day in a picture holding up this book and yawning. Now, what kind of commentary is that?
Well, it shows that I can make fun of others, but I can also make fun of myself.
Ain't that the truth? What's happened to politics? Asks Bob Rae. We hope we've answered some of them in the last half hour or so. Thanks for visiting us at TVO.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.